Imani, cleaning, is mocked by Richard Malone, who dramatically offers his empire to translate the Gurizi letter, which he assumes is impossible for her. She recognizes the script and realizes this is her only chance to save her family. Thank you for sticking around with me, and welcome back, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, back to the story. The alarm screamed at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before Imani Brooks needed to wake up, because the universe had a sick sense of humor and her phone had a dying battery that made it forget simple things like time. She silenced it with a slap and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of survival. Her mother's oxygen machine hummed its steady rhythm from the next room, a mechanical heartbeat that cost $847 a month to maintain. Malik's soft breathing rose and fell from the small bed they shared, his 7-year-old dreams probably filled with dinosaurs and the cookies Mrs. Jefferson gave him after school. The radiator clanked and groaned, fighting a losing battle against the February cold that crept through windows that should have been replaced a decade ago. $8,000. That was the number that haunted her. The number her mother's doctor had quoted for the specialized pulmonary treatment that insurance refused to cover might as well have been $8 million for all the good Imani's savings account could do. She had $342.17 in checking, $89 in savings, and a jar of quarters on the dresser that Malik thought was for ice cream but was actually for emergencies that fell below the threshold of real emergencies. $8,000 might as well have been the moon. Imani rose quietly, moving through the darkness with practiced ease, her feet finding the familiar path between the scattered toys and the laundry basket that never seemed to empty. In the bathroom, she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror, a woman of 34 who looked 40 on bad days and 25 when she remembered to smile. She began the transformation that had defined her life for the past 4 years. First, the uniform. Gray polyester that washed out her brown skin and made her look institutional, like a piece of furniture that happened to have legs. The fabric was cheap and scratchy, but it was what wealthy people expected their help to wear, so she wore it. Second, the expression. She practiced it in the mirror, the pleasant emptiness that made rich people comfortable enough to forget she existed. Not happy, which would be presumptuous. Not sad, which would be uncomfortable. Just nothing. A face that said, "I am here to serve," and then disappeared. Third, the posture. Shoulders slightly rounded. Eyes cast downward. Steps are quiet and unobtrusive. The body language of someone who took up as little space as possible, who apologized for existing with every movement. By the time she was done, Imani Brooks, the woman with dreams and degrees and a brain that could decode languages dead for centuries, had disappeared. In her place stood a maid. Anonymous. Interchangeable. Invisible. She hated every second of it. But she didn't pay medical bills, so she caught the 5:15 bus to the Gold Coast, where Chicago's wealthiest residents lived in homes large enough to have names instead of addresses. The commute was 47 minutes on a good day, longer when the weather decided to remind everyone that Chicago was basically Canada's angry cousin. Imani used the time to read linguistics journals smuggled into the pages of romance novels and academic papers folded inside celebrity magazines. The other passengers saw a tired domestic worker passing the time with trashy entertainment. They didn't see the woman studying the evolution of Semitic language roots or analyzing the morphological structures of endangered African dialects. That was the trick of invisibility. People saw what they expected to see. And nobody expected the maid to be a scholar. The truth sat in a frame on her mother's wall, gathering dust. Spelman College. Master of Arts in African Languages and Anthropology. The words should have meant something. They should have opened doors to universities and museums and foundations that paid people to preserve dying languages before they disappeared forever. Instead, they opened doors to bathrooms that needed scrubbing. Imani had graduated summa cum laude. She'd received department honors for her thesis on the evolution of Gurizi script in medieval Ethiopian religious texts. Her advisor, Dr. Kabeda, had called her work groundbreaking, essential, and exactly the kind of scholarship the field needs. Then the economy collapsed. Grant funding dried up. Universities froze hiring. Museums laid off staff. And suddenly, Imani found herself with $67,000 in student debt and no way to pay it. Her sister died that same year, leaving behind a little boy named Malik and no one else to care for him. Her mother's emphysema worsened, requiring expensive treatments that seemed designed to bankrupt anyone who wanted to keep breathing. And somewhere in the chaos, Imani's dreams got buried under the weight of everyone else's survival. She didn't resent it. Not exactly. Malik was her heart. Gloria was her foundation. She would do anything for them, including spending 4 years pretending to be something less than she was. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet and everyone else was sleeping, Imani would sit at her small desk and read the journals she couldn't afford to publish in, write papers no one would ever see, and remind herself that the invisible woman had a mind that could light up any room she entered. If only someone would let her enter. The bus deposited her 2 blocks from the Malone mansion at 6:02 a.m. She walked the rest of the way in the gray pre-dawn light, passing joggers and dog walkers who looked through her like she was part of the scenery. The Malone estate didn't have a name, but it had a reputation. Old money built on new crimes, as the neighborhood gossip went. The family had been running Chicago's underground for 3 generations, transitioning from bootlegging to gambling to whatever modern euphemism they used for organized crime these days. Richard "Ricky" Malone was the current patriarch, a 62-year-old man with silver hair, cold eyes, and the moral compass of a hungry shark. He'd inherited the empire from his father, Patrick Malone Sr., who had died 6 months ago and left behind more questions than answers. Imani had worked in this house for 4 years. In that time, Richard had spoken directly to her maybe a dozen times. He'd never learned her name. He referred to her as the maid or the help, or on one memorable occasion, the tall one with the braids. She had locks, not braids. But correcting a man who could make people disappear seemed unwise. The service entrance was around back, through an alley that smelled like money and old stone. Imani punched in the code and slipped inside, changing into her work shoes and checking the duty roster pinned to the corkboard. Today's assignments made her pause. 3rd floor bathrooms. 2nd floor guest rooms. 1st floor study. The study had been off-limits since Patrick Malone Sr. died. Richard had sealed it like a tomb, refusing to let anyone enter except himself and his inner circle. But someone had crossed out OFF limits and written deep clean, priority, in aggressive red marker. Something was happening. Imani gathered her supplies and got to work, starting with the 3rd floor and moving downward. The bathrooms were marble and chrome, designed to make rich people feel comfortable while doing things everyone did. She scrubbed and polished and sanitized, her hands moving on autopilot while her mind wandered to the stack of bills on her kitchen counter. $8,000. She'd tried everything. Payment plans, charity applications, even a GoFundMe that had raised $127 before dying of obscurity. The treatment was experimental, the insurance company said. Not covered. Not their problem. It was absolutely their problem if Gloria stopped breathing. But corporations didn't operate on human logic. By mid-morning, Imani had reached the 1st floor study. She paused outside the door, listening. Voices from inside, Richard's sharp bark and the nervous murmur of his advisors. They were arguing about something, the words muffled but the tone unmistakable. She knocked twice, waited for the grunt of acknowledgement, and pushed open the door. The study was chaotic. Papers everywhere. Boxes stacked on the antique desk. Books were pulled from shelves and scattered across the Persian rug. Richard stood in the center of it all, holding a piece of paper, as it had personally insulted his mother. $50,000, he was saying to the ferret-faced man beside him. $50,000 to experts who can't tell me anything except it might be Aramaic. Or it might be nonsense. My father hid $80 million somewhere, and the only clue is written in a language that nobody speaks. Imani's hands tightened on her supply bucket. $80 million. She moved into the room quietly, beginning to dust the shelves nearest the door. Invisible. Forgettable. Just another piece of furniture doing what furniture does. But her eyes kept drifting to the letter in Richard's hand. She could only see fragments from this angle, a corner of yellowed paper, a flash of dark ink, but something about the symbols made her heart stutter. She moved closer, adjusting her dusting pattern to bring her nearer to the desk. And then she saw it clearly. The elegant curves. The precise strokes. The ancient symbols that most people would mistake for abstract decoration. Gurizi. The liturgical language of Ethiopia. The script she had studied for 3 years at Spelman. The subject of her 200-page thesis was what had earned her honors and accolades and absolutely no job offers. Imani knew this language the way she knew her own heartbeat. And she could read every word on that page. Her hands trembled slightly as she continued dusting, her mind racing. Richard was pacing now, ranting to his advisor about incompetent academics and wasted money. He wasn't paying attention to her. He never paid attention to her. Imani pulled out her phone. It was risky, terrifyingly risky, but $8,000 was dying on her kitchen counter, and this letter clearly meant something valuable to a man who had everything. She photographed the pages one by one, the quiet click of her camera hidden beneath Richard's ongoing tirade. Her hands were steady now. The fear transformed into focus. She was taking a chance that could get her fired or worse. But invisible people learned to recognize opportunities. And this was the biggest opportunity of Imani Brooks's life. She finished photographing just as Richard turned toward the desk. She resumed dusting with practiced smoothness, her face a mask of pleasant emptiness, her expression saying, "I am here to serve," and then disappear. Richard glanced at her without seeing her. "You missed a spot," he said, gesturing vaguely at a shelf she'd already cleaned twice. "Yes, sir," Imani replied. "I'll take care of it." She took care of it. And that night, in her cramped apartment with her dying mother and sleeping son, Imani Brooks began to translate a letter that would change everything. The words swam before Imani's eyes like old friends returning from a long journey, familiar and strange at the same time. She sat at her small desk in the corner of the bedroom, laptop screen glowing in the darkness, a notebook filled with her careful handwriting. The apartment was silent except for the steady hum of Gloria's oxygen machine and the occasional creak of the old building settling into itself. Malik was asleep in the bed they shared, Professor Trunk, his stuffed elephant, standing guard on the pillow. Gloria was resting in the next room, her breathing shallow but steady. The world had shrunk to this small circle of light, this moment of translation, this bridge between ancient words and modern desperation. Imani had been at this for hours, working through the photograph pages with the methodical care that Dr. Kabeta had drilled into her during graduate school. Gurizi was not a language that rewarded impatience. Each character had to be considered, each phrase weighed against cultural context and historical usage. But despite the complexity, the meaning was becoming clear. "To those who seek the fortune I have hidden," the letter began, the archaic phrasing suggesting it had been written by someone with formal training in the script. "Know that it lies beneath the bones of old sins, where games of chance once flourished, and now only silence remains." Patrick Malone Sr. had written this. The Irish crime boss who had built an empire on blood and silence had somehow learned to write in a 2,000-year-old Ethiopian language. The absurdity of it would have made Imani laugh if the stakes weren't so high. She continued translating, her pen moving across the page in quick, precise strokes. The entrance is marked with the symbol of Lalibela, carved into stone where no stone should be. Descend 13 steps into darkness. The door that awaits requires a voice that knows the old words. Speak them true, and what is hidden shall be revealed. Lalibela. The famous rock-hewn churches of Ethiopia, carved directly into the volcanic rock in the 12th century. Patrick Malone had embedded Ethiopian cultural references throughout his confession, using them as markers and keys. Why? The question nagged at Imani as she worked, but she pushed it aside for later. Right now, she needed to focus on the practical. Where was this vault, and how could she use that knowledge? Where games of chance once flourished. A casino. It had to be. She opened a browser and typed, "Abandoned Casinos Chicago Patrick Malone." The search results painted a picture of a city's hidden history. Speakeasies that had survived Prohibition. Underground gambling dens that had flourished in the 50s. And there, on the third page of results, an article from the Chicago Tribune dated 1983. Feds shut down Paradise Club. Malone Empire takes major hit. The Paradise Club. A casino that Patrick Malone Sr. had operated on the South Side until federal investigators closed it down. The building still existed, abandoned, condemned, scheduled for demolition that had been delayed for decades due to legal disputes over the property. Beneath the bones of old sins. A vault. Under the casino. Containing $80 million. Imani sat back in her chair, staring at the notes she'd made. The translation was incomplete, there were several more pages to work through, but she had enough to prove the document was genuine. Enough to demonstrate that she could do what Richard's expensive experts couldn't. Enough to negotiate. The question was how. She couldn't simply walk into Richard Malone's study and offer her services. He'd laugh her out of the room, or worse, he'd realize she'd been photographing his private documents without permission. Either way, she'd end up fired or floating in Lake Michigan. No. She needed to be strategic. She needed to prove her value without revealing her methods. She needed to make herself essential before he could make her disposable. The plan came to her slowly, assembled from 4 years of watching how the Malone household operated. Richard was desperate. His experts had failed. And he was the kind of man who would accept help from anyone if that help got him what he wanted. Even the maid. The next morning, Imani arrived at the mansion with a carefully prepared document in her bag, a partial translation of the letter's opening section, written in her best academic handwriting. She went about her normal duties, biding her time, waiting for the right moment. It came just after lunch. Richard was in his study, surrounded by the same chaos of papers and failed translations. His advisor, Douglas, hovered nearby, offering suggestions that were immediately dismissed. Imani knocked on the open door, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Malone, I couldn't help but overhear yesterday about the letter you're trying to translate." Richard looked up, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "And I might be able to help." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at her like she'd suggested the moon was made of cheese. Douglas actually snorted. "You," Richard said flatly. "The cleaning lady. You can read ancient languages." "It's called Gurizi, sir. It's the liturgical language of Ethiopia, still used in religious texts across the Horn of Africa." Imani kept her voice steady and professional. "I have a master's degree in African languages from Spelman College. I wrote my thesis on medieval Ethiopic manuscripts." Richard's expression shifted from dismissal to confusion to something that might have been curiosity. "You have a master's degree." "Yes, sir." "And you work as a maid. The job market isn't what it used to be." Another long silence. Then Richard laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. "All right, then. Prove it." Imani pulled the translated document from her bag and handed it across the desk. "This is what the opening section says. It references a location where games of chance once flourished. Based on my research, I believe your father is referring to the Paradise Club on the South Side." Richard's hands trembled slightly as he took the paper. His eyes moved across her translation, then lifted to the original letter still on his desk, comparing symbols and meanings. His face went pale. "This is real," he breathed. "This is actually real." "Yes, sir." Richard looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in 4 years. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the gears turning as he reassessed everything he thought he knew about the woman who'd been scrubbing his toilets. "Douglas," he said, not taking his eyes off Imani, "cancel my afternoon appointments." "Sir." "I said cancel them." Richard gestured for Imani to sit. "We need to talk." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. Imani answered Richard's questions carefully, revealing enough to prove her competence but holding back enough to remain valuable. She told him about her education, her thesis, and her expertise in ancient African scripts. She didn't tell him how she'd photographed the letter or that she'd already translated more than she was letting on. By the end, Richard was looking at her with something between respect and wariness. "How much more of this can you translate?" "All of it. Given time." "How much time?" "A few days. Maybe a week." Richard nodded slowly, his fingers drumming on the desk. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. "Frankie, come to my study. We have a situation." The man who entered a few minutes later was exactly what Imani expected from a mob enforcer. Thick neck, dead eyes, hands that had clearly done things that would keep a therapist busy for years. "Yeah, boss." Richard gestured at Imani. "This is our new consultant. She's going to help us with the translation problem." Frankie's gaze slid over her, dismissive and predatory at the same time. "The maid. The linguistic expert. She doesn't leave the premises until the job is done. Keep an eye on her." Imani felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her expression neutral. "I have family at home. My mother will be taken care of." Richard's voice was final. "You'll be compensated generously for your time. But this translation is too important to risk. You understand." It wasn't a question. Richard opened the safe behind his desk, returned the letter to its secure location, and closed the heavy door with a click of finality. "Get her set up in one of the guest rooms," he told Frankie, "and make sure she has everything she needs to work." Imani was escorted upstairs by a man who looked at her like she was a problem waiting to happen. She had proven her value. She had also just become a prisoner. 3 days into her captivity, Imani discovered the truth that changed everything. Richard had been generous with resources, if not with freedom. She had access to the original letter now, carefully supervised. She had reference books, translation dictionaries, and even a laptop with heavily monitored internet access. What she didn't have was the ability to leave, to call her family, or to do anything that might compromise what Richard clearly saw as the most important secret of his life. The guest room they'd given her was comfortable. More comfortable than her apartment if she was honest, but it was still a cage. A gilded cage with Egyptian cotton sheets and a bathroom bigger than her kitchen, but a cage nonetheless. Frankie checked on her every few hours, his presence a constant reminder that helpfulness had limits and patience had expiration dates. But Imani was patient too. She'd spent 4 years being invisible. She knew how to survive. And she knew how to use her time wisely. The letter was longer than she'd initially realized from her photographs. 12 pages of dense, beautiful script that told a story far more complex than a simple treasure map. Patrick Malone Sr. hadn't just hidden money. He'd hidden guilt, shame, and a betrayal that spanned decades and continents. The translation came slowly, each page revealing new layers of a confession that made Imani's stomach turn. In the year of our Lord 1962, she translated late one night, I entered into partnership with a man named Haile Gebremedin, a diplomat from the Empire of Ethiopia. He was young then, as was I, ambitious, hungry, and blind to the consequences of our actions. We saw an opportunity where wiser men would have seen danger. The Cold War. Imani had studied this period extensively in graduate school. Ethiopia had been a key American ally in East Africa, ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie until the Communist Revolution in 1974. The country had been awash in foreign money, foreign weapons, and foreign interests. Our business was weapons. The emperor's government needed arms to maintain control. The Americans were eager to supply them, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and parties were willing to pay premium prices for expedited delivery. Haile had the connections. I had the infrastructure. Together, we built a fortune on the blood of others. Arms dealing. Patrick Malone had been an arms dealer, using his criminal network to funnel weapons into a Cold War proxy conflict. The moral clarity of her translation work was rapidly evaporating. But it got worse. For 12 years, Haile and I were partners in all things. We shared risk and reward equally. We trusted each other absolutely. He was the brother I never had and the friend I didn't deserve, and in the end, I was the architect of his destruction. Imani turned to the next page, her hands trembling slightly. When the Derg Revolution came, everything changed. The emperor fell. The communists took power. And suddenly, our American friends were very interested in distancing themselves from anyone connected to the old regime. Haile was exposed, arrested, charged with crimes against the new government, crimes that were real but that we had committed together. I could have helped him. I had the money, the connections, and the leverage to secure his release or at least his exile. Instead, I took everything. I emptied our shared accounts. I destroyed the records that would have implicated me. And I let my brother hang while I retreated to America with a fortune built on his sacrifice. The words blurred before Imani's eyes. She set down her pen and walked to the window, staring out at the manicured grounds of the Malone estate without really seeing them. Patrick Malone had betrayed his partner. Let him be imprisoned, probably executed, while stealing everything they'd built together. And for 40 years, he'd lived in luxury on blood money that wasn't entirely his. But the confession wasn't finished. Haile died in prison in 1978. He had a wife and a daughter, Makeda, who fled to Kenya and then to Europe. They had nothing but the knowledge that half the fortune I enjoyed was rightfully theirs. I told myself I would make amends. I told myself there would be time to set things right. But time is a liar, and now I am dying and the debt remains unpaid. The final pages of the letter detailed the vault, its location, its security measures, and its contents. $80 million in cash, gold, and bearer bonds, accumulated over decades of criminal enterprise. But embedded in those instructions was something Richard's experts had apparently missed: a moral clause. This fortune is not mine alone. Half belongs to the heir of Haile Gebremedin, his granddaughter, Leah, who now lives in London. If you have found this letter and seek to claim the money, know that you inherit my debt as well. The moral obligation cannot be separated from the material gain. To take one without honoring the other is to damn yourself as I have damned myself. The vault is sealed with the words of binding, a phrase in the language Haile taught me, the language of his ancestors. Speak the truth, and what is hidden shall be revealed. But know that in speaking them, you accept the burden of my guilt. The old words do not lie, and neither can you. Imani set down the final page, her mind reeling. Patrick Malone had tried to force his heir to do what he himself couldn't. Honor a debt to the family he'd destroyed. The vault wasn't just protected by security. It was protected by conscience. The Guizi phrase required to open it was a binding oath, a cultural and spiritual contract that would obligate the speaker to fulfill the terms of the confession. $40 million. Half the fortune. Owed to a woman named Leah, who probably had no idea she was the heir to a blood-soaked legacy. And Richard Malone would never pay it. Imani knew this with absolute certainty. She'd watched Richard for 4 years. She'd seen how he treated people, how he calculated value, and how he discarded anything that didn't serve his immediate interests. He would take the $80 million, ignore the moral clause, and bury the truth so deep that no one would ever find it. Unless someone stopped him. Unless someone who could read the letter decided that Patrick Malone's final wish actually mattered. The door unlocked behind her. Frankie stepped in with her dinner tray, steak tonight, because prisoners in gilded cages ate well. Boss wants to know how much longer, he said, setting the tray on the desk. Imani looked at the translation notes scattered across her workspace. Notes that could condemn or liberate, depending on how she chose to use them. Tell him I'm making progress, she said. These things take time. Frankie grunted and left, locking the door behind him. Imani stared at the pages of her translation, weighing options and consequences. She had a choice to make. And for the first time in 4 years, the invisible woman had the power to change everything. By the second week of her confinement, Imani had learned every secret the Malone mansion held. Not through snooping, she was too closely watched for that, but through the same skill that had kept her invisible for 4 years, listening. Existing in spaces where people forgot she was present. Filing away conversations that others assumed were private. Frankie talked on his phone outside her door, his thick voice carrying through wood that looked solid but wasn't. Richard argued with his accountants in the study directly below, the sound traveling through old ventilation ducts that connected the rooms. Connor, the nephew, complained to anyone who would listen about his uncle's obsession with that stupid letter, usually while drunk and standing beneath Imani's window. The mansion was a symphony of secrets, and Imani had perfect pitch. She learned that Richard's empire was crumbling faster than anyone knew. The Colombians were demanding payment for a shipment that had gone wrong somewhere between Miami and Chicago. Rival families smelled weakness like sharks smelled blood. The $80 million in Patrick's vault wasn't just a windfall. It was the difference between survival and destruction. She learned that Connor was more dangerous than he appeared. Behind the spoiled playboy exterior was a calculating mind that resented his uncle's authority and was building alliances with people Richard considered enemies. She learned that Frankie wasn't just muscle. He was ambitious. He'd been positioning himself for years, waiting for an opportunity to become indispensable. Imani's translation work was that opportunity, and he intended to claim credit for it when the time came. And she learned something else. Something that changed the game entirely. On the 14th day of her captivity, Imani was escorted to Richard's library to retrieve reference materials for her translation work. Frankie waited by the door, bored and impatient, scrolling through his phone while she scanned the shelves. The library was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves filled with books that looked more decorative than read. Travel guides, art collections, leather-bound classics that had probably never been opened. But one section caught her attention. A shelf dedicated to Ethiopia. Travel guides from the 1960s, their spines cracked with use. Historical texts about the Solomonic dynasty. A coffee table book about the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, filled with photographs that made Imani's heart ache for a homeland she'd never seen. And there, tucked between a biography of Haile Selassie and a collection of Amharic poetry, a slim leather journal with no title on the spine. Something about it felt familiar. Imani pulled the journal from the shelf, her movements casual, unhurried. Just another reference book. Just another resource for her translation work. She opened it, and the world tilted beneath her feet. The handwriting was her grandmother's. Tsehe Brooks, the woman who had raised Imani's mother, who had taught Imani to read Gurizi on a porch in Atlanta, tracing ancient characters with wooden sticks while telling stories about a homeland that existed only in memory. "This is your heritage," Grandma Tsehe used to say. "This is where you come from. Never forget." Imani had never forgotten, but she'd also never known the full truth. The journal was a chronicle. Decades of entries spanning from the 1960s to the early 2000s. Her grandmother had documented everything. The cultural traditions she'd brought from Ethiopia, the language she'd fought to preserve, the family she'd left behind, and the family she'd built in America. But there was more. Her grandmother had known Patrick Malone. The entries from the 1970s and 80s made it clear. Tsehe Brooks had been connected to the Ethiopian community in Chicago, had helped refugees navigate the chaos of the Derg Revolution, and had served as a cultural liaison for people caught between worlds. And she had known about Haile Gebremedin. The Malone man came again today. One entry read, "He asks questions about the old language, about binding phrases and moral obligations. He is haunted by something. I can see it in his eyes. He carries a debt he cannot pay, a sin he cannot confess. I told him that the words of binding are not games to be played, that speaking to them means accepting what they require. He did not listen. Men like him never do." Imani's grandmother had taught Patrick Malone about Gurizi, had explained the cultural weight of the binding phrases he'd embedded in his vault security system, had warned him about the moral obligations that came with the old words. But she'd also left behind instructions. The final pages of the journal detailed the specific phrase Patrick had used, the Kal Kidden, the binding oath that would open the vault and seal the speaker's commitment to the terms of the confession. Her grandmother had known everything, and she'd left the knowledge where her granddaughter could find it. Imani looked up. Frankie was still distracted, his phone consuming his attention. She had seconds, maybe less. She slipped the journal into the waistband of her pants, hidden beneath her loose sweater. Then she selected a random reference book from the shelf, something about Ethiopian church architecture, and walked calmly toward the door. "Find what you needed?" Frankie asked, barely glancing at her. "Yes," Imani said. "I think I found exactly what I needed." That night, alone in her gilded cage, Imani read her grandmother's journal from cover to cover. The moral clause was real. The binding oath was real. And Richard Malone could not access the vault without speaking words that would obligate him. Culturally, spiritually, and according to his father's legal documents, to honor the debt to Leah Gebremedin. Patrick Malone Sr. had set a trap for his own heir. And Imani had the key. The first sign of desperation came on the 18th day. Imani was in her room, poring over her grandmother's journal for the 100th time, when she heard the cars. Multiple vehicles pulled up to the mansion in the kind of coordinated arrival that suggested importance. She moved to the window and watched as Richard emerged from the house, flanked by Frankie and two other guards. They climbed into a black SUV and drove away without explanation. 3 hours later, they returned. Richard's face told the story before anyone spoke a word. The fury etched into his features, the tension in his shoulders, the way he slammed the car door hard enough to echo across the grounds, all of it spoke to failure. They had gone to the Paradise Club. They had found the vault. and they hadn't been able to open it. Imani allowed herself a small smile, quickly suppressed. The security system was working exactly as Patrick had designed. The door required a voice, a specific phrase spoken with correct pronunciation. Richard's team had probably tried everything: recordings, approximations, and brute force. None of it had worked. Because the vault wasn't just locked. It was waiting for someone who could speak the binding oath truthfully, with full understanding of what the words meant. Richard needed Imani more than ever, which made what happened next even more dangerous. Frankie came to her room that evening, his thick face twisted into an expression that might have been a smile on someone with more practice. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. Imani set down her pen, keeping her expression neutral. "About what?" "About your cooperation." Frankie moved deeper into the room, his bulk blocking the only exit. "See, the boss is getting impatient. He tried to open that vault today using the translation you gave us. Didn't work. I told him it would take time. The final phrase is complex. The final phrase is something you've been holding back." Frankie's voice hardened. "You think we don't know? You've been stringing us along, giving just enough to stay valuable but not enough to be disposable. That's not. Save it." Frankie pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. On it was a photograph, grainy, clearly taken from a surveillance feed. It showed Gloria Brooks, sitting in her apartment, oxygen tube looped over her ears. Imani's blood ran cold. "Nice lady, your mother," Frankie said casually. "Heard she's got some health problems. Needs expensive treatment. Be a shame if something happened to her insurance claim. Or her oxygen supply. Or—" He shrugged. "Her. You wouldn't. Lady, you have no idea what I would or wouldn't do." Frankie slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to give us the complete translation. Tonight. Every word, every phrase, everything you've been holding back. And if I do, then your mother stays healthy, your kid stays safe, and you walk away from this with more money than you've seen in your life. And if I don't—" Frankie's smile widened. "Then things get complicated." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Inside were papers, Imani's own handwritten translations, recopied in someone else's handwriting. "One more thing," Frankie said. "When this is over, when the vault is open and the money is in the boss's hands, I'm the one who figured out the translation. I'm the one who cracked the code. The linguistics genius who saved the day." He tapped the folder. "You're just the maid who happened to know some fancy words." Imani stared at him. "You're taking credit for my work." "I'm protecting the boss's interests. If people knew he relied on a cleaning lady to unlock his father's fortune, he'd look weak. This way everyone wins. I get a promotion. He gets his money. You get to go home. That's not winning. That's theft. That's reality, sweetheart." Frankie dropped the folder on her desk. "You've got until morning. Make it count." He walked out, leaving the door unlocked, a message that her cage had just gotten smaller, but her chains had gotten tighter. Imani sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the folder of stolen translations. They had her mother. They had her son's safety. They had everything they needed to destroy her life if she didn't cooperate. But they didn't have the one thing that actually mattered. They didn't have her grandmother's journal. They didn't understand the cultural weight of the binding phrase. They didn't know that speaking the words incorrectly wouldn't just fail to open the vault, it would lock it permanently. Imani had knowledge they couldn't take. And she was going to use it. She pulled out the journal and began to plan. Not just for survival anymore. For victory. The tension in the Malone mansion reached a breaking point 3 days later, when everything converged at once. Imani knew something was wrong the moment she was escorted downstairs. The guards were doubled at every entrance. Staff members moved with the careful silence of people trying not to attract predators. And Richard Malone himself looked like a man who had aged a decade overnight. "The study," Frankie said curtly, grabbing her arm. "Now." She was deposited in the corner of the room with a silver tray and instructions to serve coffee. Back to being invisible. Back to being the help. But Imani had learned that invisibility had advantages. The study was crowded in a way she'd never seen before. Richard sat behind his father's desk, trying to project authority he clearly didn't feel. Douglas hovered nearby, his ferret face twitching with anxiety. 2 guards flanked the door, hands near their weapons. And across the desk, 2 groups of people who clearly hated each other almost as much as they hated Richard. The first group was led by a woman. Tall, elegant, dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than Imani's yearly salary. Her skin was dark, her features distinctly East African, and her expression suggested she had exactly 0 patience for whatever games were about to be played. "Ms. Abasai," Richard said with forced pleasantness. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't have much choice, Mr. Malone. When someone claims to have information about my client's family legacy, I investigate." Her client. The heir. Leah Jebremedin. Imani's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face neutral, her hands steady as she poured coffee. The second group was smaller but more dangerous. 2 men in expensive suits, their posture casual but their eyes constantly scanning for threats. The leader was in his 40s, red-haired, with a kind of smile that promised violence wrapped in charm. "Sean O'Connell," Richard said, not bothering with pleasantries. "You shouldn't be here. And miss this? Not a chance." O'Connell settled into his chair like he owned it. "Word on the street is that old Patrick left behind quite the fortune. Word also is that you can't seem to access it. Word is wrong. Word is never wrong. Word is just early." O'Connell's smile widened. "Here's what I know. Your father owed my father a considerable sum when he died. I'm here to collect with interest. You have no claim to anything in this room." "Don't I? Because the way I see it, you're sitting on $80 million that you can't touch. The Colombians want their payment by Friday. Your operation is hemorrhaging money. And the only thing standing between you and total collapse is whatever's in that vault." O'Connell leaned forward. "I'm offering a partnership. 50-50 split. I help you access the money, and we both walk away rich. And if I refuse, then I walk out of here and tell everyone in Chicago exactly where Patrick Malone hid his fortune. How long do you think it'll stay hidden after that?" The room crackled with tension. Imani moved quietly around the perimeter, refilling cups, existing on the edges of a confrontation that could determine the fate of millions. Ms. Abasai cleared her throat. "Perhaps we could focus on the actual matter at hand. My client, Leah Jebremedin, is the granddaughter of Haile Jebremedin, Patrick Malone's former business partner. According to documents I've obtained, half the fortune in that vault rightfully belongs to her family." Richard laughed bitterly. "Documents? What documents?" "Letters. Financial records. Testimony from people who witnessed the partnership." Ms. Abasai opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder. "Your father and Haile Jebremedin built that fortune together. When Haile was arrested during the Ethiopian Revolution, your father took everything and fled. My client is simply asking for what her grandfather was owed. Your client is asking for $40 million based on 50-year-old hearsay. My client is asking for justice." O'Connell laughed. "Justice. That's rich. None of us is here for justice, sweetheart. We're here for money. Speak for yourself, Mr. O'Connell. The argument continued, voices rising and falling, threats veiled and unveiled, alliances proposed and rejected. Richard was drowning, and everyone in the room could see it, including Imani. She moved around the room, coffee pot in hand, invisible to everyone but essential to all. She heard every accusation, every justification, every desperate gambit as Richard tried to maintain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his grasp. Finally, Richard reached into his desk and pulled out a paper, a translation. Imani recognized her own handwriting, modified and rewritten in Frankie's heavy scrawl. "This," Richard announced, "is the complete translation of my father's letter. It provides the vault location, the access phrase, and contrary to what Ms. Abasai claims, no mention of any moral obligation to anyone." The room went quiet. Ms. Abasai's eyes narrowed. "I don't believe you. I don't care what you believe. The translation is clear. The fortune is mine. The only question is whether any of you want to negotiate for a piece of it." "And the access phrase?" O'Connell asked. "Your man can speak this ancient language?" Richard hesitated for just a moment. "The pronunciation has been verified." Imani almost laughed. The pronunciation had not been verified. Richard still couldn't open the vault. He was bluffing, buying time, hoping that his competitors would fold before they realized he had nothing. But they weren't going to fold. Ms. Abasai was too determined. O'Connell was too hungry. And somewhere in London, a woman named Leah owed $40 million that she would never see if Richard had his way. Imani made a decision. 4 years of invisibility. 4 years of being looked through, talked around, and forgotten. 4 years of swallowing her pride and her education and her dreams because survival required submission. No more. She set down her coffee pot and stepped forward into the center of the room. That's not what the letter says. Every head in the room turned toward the corner where Imani had been invisible for the past hour. Richard's face contorted with rage. "Who the hell? My name is Imani Brooks." She stepped forward, shoulders straight, voice steady. "I have a master's degree in African languages from Spelman College. I'm the one who actually translated your father's letter. And I'm telling you and everyone in this room that what you just read is a lie." The silence that followed was absolute. O'Connell leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering across his face. Douglas looked like he might faint. And Richard Malone stared at her with an expression that promised violence if they were alone. "She's the maid," he said flatly. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Imani reached beneath her sweater and withdrew her grandmother's journal. She'd been carrying it for days, waiting for this moment. "This belonged to my grandmother, Sehe Brooks. She was Ethiopian. She taught me to read Guizi before I could write English. And she also taught Patrick Malone." Ms. Abasai straightened in her chair, her eyes sharp with sudden interest. "What did you say?" "My grandmother knew your client's grandfather. She was connected to the Ethiopian community here during the revolution. She helped refugees, preserved cultural traditions, and—" Imani opened the journal to a marked page. "She taught Patrick Malone the language he used to write his confession and secure his vault." Richard started to speak, but O'Connell raised a hand. "Let the lady finish. This just got very interesting. The translation Frankie prepared, the one Richard just presented, is wrong." Imani kept her voice calm and professional, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. "The pronunciation is wrong. The meaning is wrong. If you tried to open the vault with what he gave you, the security system would lock permanently. You'd never access that money." Richard's face went white. "You're bluffing." Then call it. Imani held up the journal. This contains detailed notes on Ethiopian ceremonial language, including the specific phrase your father used to secure his vault. It's called a kal-kidden, a binding oath, and it doesn't just open a door. She paused, letting the words sink in. It binds the speaker to honor the terms embedded in the original document. Ms. Abesai was on her feet now. The moral clause. It's real. Very real. Imani turned to face her directly. Patrick Malone's letter is a confession. He admits to betraying Haile Gebremedin, stealing the fortune they built together, and leaving his partner to die in an Ethiopian prison. He spent 40 years living with that guilt. And when he designed the vault, he embedded a cultural safeguard that would force his heir to do what he couldn't. Which is, honor the debt. Half the fortune, $40 million, belongs to the Gebremedin family. Patrick's letter states this explicitly, and the binding phrase required to open the vault obligates whoever speaks it to fulfill those terms. Richard slammed his fist on the desk. This is insane. Ethiopian cultural traditions have no legal standing here. You can't force me to. I can't force you to do anything. Imani's voice cut through his bluster like a blade. But your father can. He designed this system specifically because he knew you. He knew you would never honor a debt you didn't have to pay. So he made it so you have to. She opened the journal to the final page, the one her grandmother had written specifically about the vault. The phrase is more than words. It's a contract. In Ethiopian tradition, a kal-kidden binds the speaker absolutely. Your father converted to Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity before he died. There are records. He embedded his conversion documents in the vault's legal structure. If you speak the phrase and take the money without honoring the debt, you're not just breaking a promise. You're committing fraud under the terms of his will. The room was utterly silent. Richard looked like a man watching his own execution. O'Connell looked like a man watching the best entertainment he'd had in years. And Ms. Abesai looked at Imani with something approaching reverence. Can you prove this? She asked. Imani handed her the journal. My grandmother's documentation. The cultural context. The specific linguistic structures Patrick used. And if that's not enough, she turned to Richard. I can speak the phrase myself. Right now. In perfect Gurizi. And when the vault opens, every word I've said will be validated. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. You planned this. No, Mr. Malone. Your father planned this. 40 years ago, he set a trap for his own heir. A test to see if his son was capable of being better than he was. Imani met his eyes without flinching. You failed. But there's still time to pass. The room held its breath. Richard Malone looked around at the assembled forces, the rival gang leader who would destroy him, the lawyer who would sue him, the translator who had outmaneuvered him, and saw the same thing in every face. Checkmate. What do you want? He asked finally. Imani smiled. Now we negotiate. The negotiation lasted 6 hours. By the end, the study looked like a battlefield. Papers scattered across every surface, coffee cups abandoned, alliances formed and broken and reformed. But for the first time since Patrick Malone died, everyone in the room had found something like common ground. Richard Malone would keep 50% of the vault's contents. $40 million, enough to satisfy the Colombians and stabilize his crumbling empire. In exchange, he would publicly acknowledge the Gebremedin family's claim and transfer their share to accounts specified by Ms. Abesai. O'Connell would receive $10 million from Richard's portion, debt collection he called it, though everyone knew it was extortion. But $10 million was better than nothing, and it kept him from making good on his threat to expose the vault's location to every criminal in Chicago. Ms. Abesai and her client would receive their $40 million, plus a formal letter of apology that Richard had struggled to write and Imani had eventually drafted herself. It wasn't justice. Justice would have been Haile Gebremedin living to see his family vindicated, but it was something. And Imani. Imani got everything she'd asked for and more. $500,000, she said, her voice steady. Untrace. Transferred to an account I specify before anyone touches that vault. Richard stared at her. That's my fee for the translation. Plus 18 days of unlawful imprisonment. Plus 4 years of being called the Maid, by a man who couldn't be bothered to learn my name. I know your name. You learned it 3 hours ago. You've known me for 4 years. Imani didn't blink. 500,000. Non-negotiable. Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Second. Imani continued. My mother receives the medical treatment she needs. Full coverage. Whatever it costs. You have resources. Use them. Done. Third. My family receives guaranteed protection. Documented, witnessed, and legally binding. If anything happens to my mother, my son, or me, the contents of my grandmother's journal, including detailed documentation of your father's illegal arms dealing, go public. Ms. Abasai raised an eyebrow. You have documentation of arms dealing? I have documentation of everything. Imani smiled slightly. My grandmother was very thorough. Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. 4 years of invisibility had taught Imani to read people. Richard Malone was finally understanding that the woman he'd dismissed as the help was far more dangerous than he'd imagined. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. Protection. Documentation. Whatever you need. And finally, Imani straightened her spine. When this is over, you will publicly acknowledge that I was the one who translated the letter. Not Frankie. Not any of the experts you paid. Me. Imani Brooks, Master of Arts in African Languages, Spelman College. Richard laughed bitterly. You want credit. I want recognition. I spent 4 years being invisible in your house. I have a degree that I couldn't use because the world decided someone like me didn't deserve opportunities. I am done being unseen. Her voice was steel. You will acknowledge my work. You will ensure that everyone who matters knows that a black woman with a mop and a master's degree outsmarted every expert you threw money at. The room was silent. Then O'Connell laughed, a genuine, delighted sound. I like her, he said. You should hire her, Malone. God knows you need someone with brains in your organization. I work for myself, Imani said. From now on, I work for myself. The final agreements were documented, witnessed, and signed. The vault would be opened the next morning, with representatives from all parties present. Imani would speak the binding phrase. She was the only one who could pronounce it correctly, and the fortune would be divided according to the terms they'd negotiated. As the room emptied, Ms. Abasai approached Imani with something like respect in her eyes. You're remarkable, she said. My client will want to meet you when this is over. She should know the woman who finally brought her grandfather justice. I'd like that. And if you ever need legal representation, for your new business, whatever it becomes, please consider my firm. We could use someone with your skills. Imani smiled. I'll keep that in mind. The next morning, they opened the vault. Imani spoke the binding phrase in perfect, flowing Gurizi, her grandmother's journal in hand. The ancient words filled the underground chamber like music, and when she finished, the massive door swung open to reveal exactly what Patrick Malone had promised. $80 million in cash, gold, and bearer bonds. The fortune was divided. The debts were paid. And Imani Brooks walked out of the Paradise Club's basement into the Chicago sunlight with a check for $500,000 and a future that finally belonged to her. She never cleaned another toilet again. 6 months later, Imani Brooks stood at the window of her corner office on the 47th floor of the Willis Tower, watching the sun set over Lake Michigan. The plaque on her door read, Brooks Global Linguistics, Cultural Consultation and Translation Services. Beneath it, in smaller letters, Bridging Worlds Through Words. The office hummed with quiet activity. 3 employees worked at sleek desks, handling inquiries from clients across the globe. A conference room hosted a video call with a museum in Addis Ababa. And on the wall, framed beside her Spelman diploma, was a Chicago Tribune article with the headline, Maid Turned Mogul. How One Woman's Hidden Talents Unlocked a Fortune. The story had gone viral. The invisible maid who could read ancient languages, the crime boss who couldn't see what was right in front of him, the $80 million hidden beneath the bones of old sins. Imani had done interviews, spoken at conferences, and been profiled in magazines that had never considered domestic workers worth noticing. She'd used the attention wisely. Brooks Global Linguistics wasn't just a business. It was a mission. Imani had made it her purpose to find other invisible people, brilliant minds trapped in jobs that didn't see them, and give them opportunities to shine. Her first hire had been a janitor from Northwestern with a PhD in ancient Sumerian. Her second was a hotel housekeeper who spoke 7 African languages fluently. Her third was a line cook who had been a professor of Persian literature before fleeing Iran. Invisible people. Hidden talents. Extraordinary minds trapped in ordinary circumstances. Imani found them. She hired them. She made sure the world finally saw what they could do. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. Malik wants to know if you're coming to dinner. He made you a card. Imani smiled. Tell him I'll be there by 7. Save me some of whatever you're cooking. Greens and cornbread. Your grandmother's recipe. Her grandmother. Tsehe Brooks, who had carried secrets across oceans and generations. Who had preserved a language and a legacy that had ultimately saved her granddaughter's life. Who had left behind a journal that had changed everything. Imani kept that journal on her desk now, next to a framed photograph of her grandmother, her mother, and herself. 3 generations of women who had survived by being invisible and thrived when they finally let themselves be seen. A knock at the door. Ms. Brooks. Her assistant was a young woman named Desta who had been working as a parking attendant 6 months ago. Your 3 o'clock is here. Send them in. The client was a museum director from London, a distinguished man with gray temples and an air of academic authority. He'd flown across the Atlantic specifically to consult with Imani about a collection of manuscripts his institution had recently acquired. Thank you for seeing me, Ms. Brooks, he said, shaking her hand. Your reputation precedes you. They say you're the best in the field. They're not wrong. Imani gestured toward the conference table, where the manuscripts waited in protective cases. Let's see what you've brought me. She settled into her chair, opened the first case, and examined the ancient text inside. The script was familiar, a variation of Guri-Z, probably from the 15th century, based on the stylistic markers. Can you read it? The director asked, leaning forward anxiously. Imani traced the elegant characters with her eyes, the ancient words coming alive in her mind the same way they had on that first morning when she'd photographed a letter in a crime boss's study and started a chain of events that would transform her life. She smiled. I can read everything. The director visibly relaxed. Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. They worked for 3 hours, Imani translating and explaining, the director taking notes and asking questions. By the end, he looked at her with something approaching awe. You've just solved a mystery that stumped our researchers for 2 years. I don't know how to thank you. Payment works. Imani said dryly. But you're welcome. After he left, she returned to her office window and watched the city lights begin to twinkle below. Chicago spread out before her, the same city that had overlooked her for so long, that had seen a maid when it should have seen a scholar. She thought about Richard Malone, who had finally learned her name but would never forget the lesson she'd taught him. She thought about Frankie, who had tried to steal her work and ended up unemployed. She thought about Connor, who had underestimated her and paid the price. She thought about all the people who had looked through her, talked around her, and treated her like furniture. They saw her now. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. Malone Empire continues legitimate transition. Sources credit new cultural partnerships. Richard was doing what he'd promised, moving the family business away from crime toward legitimate enterprise. Whether it was genuine reform or just good publicity was impossible to tell. But the checks to the Jebremedin family cleared every month, and Leah had established a foundation in her grandfather's name to support Ethiopian refugees. Some good had come from the ugliness. Some justice had been served. And Imani Brooks was exactly where she belonged. She gathered her things, turned off the office lights, and headed for the elevator. Malik's card was waiting for her. Her mother's cooking was waiting for her. A life she'd built with her own hands was waiting for her. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and Imani stepped out into the lobby. People moved around her. Business people, tourists, janitors, and security guards. A woman in a cleaning uniform mopped the floor near the entrance, her eyes downcast, her movements efficient and invisible. Imani stopped. She thought about walking past the way everyone else did. The way she herself had been walked past for 4 years. Instead, she approached the woman. "Excuse me." The woman looked up, surprise flickering across her face. People in expensive clothes didn't usually talk to her. "I'm Imani Brooks. I run a translation company on the 47th floor." Imani pulled a card from her wallet and held it out. "I'm always looking for talented people. People who might have skills that don't show up on a resume. If you know anyone like that, or if you're someone like that, I'd love to hear from you." The woman took the card, staring at it with an expression Imani recognized. Hope. Fragile. Cautious. Beaten down hope. "Thank you," the woman said quietly. "I thank you." Imani smiled and walked out into the Chicago night. Behind her, in a glass tower that reached toward the stars, the words on her door caught the light from a passing car. Brooks Global Linguistics. Bridging worlds through words. The invisible woman had built her own empire, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure no one else had to stay invisible. Some people spend their entire lives waiting for permission to be extraordinary. Permission that never comes from the people who can't see past uniforms and assumptions. But the truth is, you don't need permission. You need preparation. You need patience. And you need the courage to step forward when the moment arrives. If you believe that talent doesn't care about tax brackets, that brilliance can wear a cleaning uniform, and that invisible people are often the most extraordinary of all, hit subscribe. Only people like the old Richard Malone, people who look through others instead of at them, would scroll past without acknowledging what we all know to be true. And if you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or underestimated, if you carry gifts that the world hasn't noticed yet, comment "I am seen" below. Because Imani's story isn't just hers. It's waiting to be yours, too. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out.